Hey, everybody, we're back to the Shanty. A couple of weeks ago, I had Sarah on and we reached out to you and asked you if there were any immigration related questions, given everything that's going on in the world, that you had that we might be able to get you some answers for. And when I say we, I mean Sarah, because I have no answers to any of these questions at all. So you guys did send in a bunch of questions, unfortunately, more than we can answer in the short period of time here. But we are going to try to hit the highlights, and Sarah's going to give you some answers. So I'm going to ask, and Sarah's going to answer, and away we go. You ready, Sarah?
I'm ready.
All right, let's start with the first question. With everything in the news lately, as an employer, should I be restricting international travel to only emergency situations for non-US citizen employees? And I assume this is talking about people that are in the United States now, traveling outside the United States and coming back.
Yes, that's how I would take the question too. But I think the answer to that is somewhat nuanced in the sense that I think now is a good inflection point for employers to sort of take a critical look at the travel that they have for their employees that's business related and maybe, start thinking about it and perhaps set a policy to at least assess, how often are we going to ask our employees to travel? Where are we asking them to travel to? How critical are these employees to have back into the US in a reasonable amount of time? Maybe they're working on something mission critical for the employer. Because I think what we have to look at, I don't think I would say that it has to be only emergency situations, but the caveat I have to that is we're in a constantly evolving environment at the moment. And one thing that I think, immigration attorneys in particular are looking at and kind of waiting for a further announcement on is an anticipated travel ban. Because when Donald Trump took office on January 20th, he signed an array of executive orders, one of which included a directive to the US Department of State to basically have the Department of State conduct an assessment of the countries around the world of who is providing deficient versus, I guess, what they deem sufficient information to vet nationals of those countries who are applying for visas to come to the United States. So within the last couple of weeks, the New York Times published an article that contained supposedly leaked or list of potential travel ban countries, and it had a three-tiered system. So it was red, orange, and yellow. And on the list of red countries, which travel would be banned by nationals of those countries, we think like in total, right? We don't know yet if that would apply to legal permanent residents who are from those countries or non-immigrant visa holders from those countries. But, we'll see as things continue to come out. Those 11 countries, though, that would be a real risk, right? If you have business travel going on to one of those countries and suddenly a travel ban is put into place, then it's possible you could have employees stuck outside the US,
Okay.
depending on what that eventual travel ban is. And then for those orange countries, which it's a slightly bigger list, visas are going to be seriously restricted. And we think that in-person visa interviews are going to be required for nationals of those countries. And then there's a yellow list of countries. It's like 22 countries where additional kind of vetting has to occur to see if they're going to provide what our administration deems sufficient information to not end up on the orange or the red list.
Okay. But it also sounds like we ought to be telling our foreign national employees, hey, be careful about, going home for the holiday or something like that.
Well, so I've been taking a sort of more measured approach with my clients because I've had several ask me this within the last month. And I've said, I think this is a good time for us to create sort of an alert to employees and or set a sort of town hall if you'd like. I've told them like I'm happy to be sort of the leader of this town hall and provide the content for this alert, but I think let's get our house in order, right? If we have employees that are traveling internationally for business, let's make sure that they have the proper paperwork with them. Let's make sure that their passports are valid for 6 months beyond the date of travel. Let's make sure that they know the common questions they're likely to be asked by U.S. Customs and Border Protection to sort of ensure a smoother travel experience. And the other thing is, there's some anxiety surrounding this too. So it's also an opportunity just to answer questions from those employees to hopefully sort of hopefully allay some concerns or make people feel a little more secure. Because I think the biggest theme of the last few months has been unpredictability, and that's very anxiety inducing for the employers and also for their foreign national employees, particularly if they're in a global role that they have to travel to be effective.
Okay. All right. So this is like a non-administration question, I guess. We just hit the H-1B cap, closed on March 24th. It's always wonderful when a year-long cap closes in the first quarter. Do you anticipate any issues with this year's H-1B cap submissions?
Well, so the thing about the H-1B lottery, right? So this is how it works every year. All of the H-1B sort of visa allocation is people have to register in a lottery that occurs usually for 2 to 3 weeks every March. So there's a different sort of lottery for H-2A and H-2B visas, which are for agricultural workers and like peak season workers. The H-1B visa lottery is for professional level workers. So to qualify for an H-1B visa, the position itself must require at least a bachelor's degree, and the foreign national has to have a degree in a related field. So for employers that have these type of workers, right, maybe they've hired someone who's graduated from a US bachelor's or master's program and has work authorization for a period of time following their graduation, and they've decided like, hey, we really like this person, they're working out, we want to keep them longer term. They would put that person in the H-1B cap lottery, and then if they're selected, we can file an H-1B petition for them, which has to be received by June 30th of this year. So as you said, the registration period just closed on March 24th, and the USCIS ran the lottery primarily over the weekend. We're still waiting for the announcement that they've fully reached the visa, that first round selection is complete. I anticipate that will probably come out maybe today or tomorrow. But in terms of issues with this, the CAB registration process and them notifying us of selections went pretty smoothly as it does and as it has in the last several years. I think we're waiting to see if there's going to be increased requests for evidence issued for those petitions, and also if there's going to be processing delays, like if things are taking longer. That's probably the two things I would anticipate. In Trump's first administration, we saw an uptick in the level of requests for evidence, right, where they were just really digging into every element of eligibility and of the petition, and sort of in some ways coming up with things that have not been questioned before in his first term. They really questioned whether or not a level one wage was sufficient, whether that, made it not a specialty occupation position, which ultimately we were able to refute, because every occupation has 4 wage levels that are published by the Department of Labor. So if you're a surgeon, they're still level 1 through 4, because it has to do with, are
Right.
you a recent graduate versus a very experienced worker? So it's pretty hard to say that a level 1 surgeon doesn't require at least a bachelor's degree, right? That's clearly a specialty occupation.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily take that level 1 wage as evidence that it's not a specialty occupation. But we had to fight that in the first administration, and it's possible we may have similar things we have to fight this time.
Okay. All right. We're 2 questions in. I think I forgot which question I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about the Jays and the participating in cultural exchange programs. Do you think recent immigration changes will impact the willingness of countries to grant J-1 visas, or for the U.S. to be welcoming to students and others participating in cultural exchange programs? You want me to answer that one? I got some.
I mean, I guess let's let's properly frame the question to start with, and then I would love to hear your thoughts as well. But so the US government, so foreign governments don't grant J-1 visas, right? J-1 visas are granted by the US, and it's a program that's administered by the US Department of State. Because in order for a foreign national to get a J-1 visa, which is a cultural exchange visa for the most part, you have to go through a designated program sponsor, which are organizations designated by the US Department of State. So J-1s are granted in a range of circumstances, right? It's everything from like an au pair to a foreign physician who wants to come and complete a residency or a fellowship here in the US. So I don't know that that's going to fundamentally change. Maybe we will see the Department of State change or reduce the number of approved program sponsors. There hasn't really been talk of that yet, so I don't know if that's something I anticipate. But I do think that foreign international students may be more hesitant to come to the US just because of the current environment, and sort of a sense of maybe fear or uncertainty about how they may be treated in the US with a lot of the things that have been in the news media lately, about arrests and detentions, on campuses and at the US border for a variety of reasons.
Well, look, I try not to editorialize in these things, but I think it's foolish for us to think that we can continue to act this way and not have foreign governments say, fine, then we will too. So I'm inclined to agree with you. I think that it's going to be a lot harder to get people to come here if we're not making it welcome and friendly for them to come here. So
Yeah, and that could have some serious repercussions for us economically and in other ways. Like,
correct.
as of 2023, the number of international students in US institutions was 1.12 million. That's a pretty huge factor for our economy, for the
Well,
schools. It creates jobs.
and we represent a lot of colleges and universities, as you know. Many of them are having enrollment issues. They're not getting enough kids enrolled. So if we take a whole pool of students out of that and make them no longer available, that's going to hurt those colleges and universities too. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So
Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely.
all right, one last question. We utilize an employment agency specializing in relocating people with work visas from Central and South America. This is a permanent temp arrangement with the agency. These workers are not on our company's payroll. What's our obligation to ensure that they are properly documented? And can we require temp agencies to use E-Verify?
Okay, this is a good question and a sort of complicated one. So I think, as the immigration attorney, which I'm interested to hear your thoughts as the employment lawyer, Steve, from an immigration perspective, I would say that the staffing agency is, if they're the employer of record for these individuals, they're the ones with the obligation to complete I-9s for these workers and ensure that they have presented documents that show their authorization to work in the United States. Um, so regarding E-Verify, E-Verify is primarily a voluntary program unless the employer is usually a federal contractor, or there are some states that do mandate it. Michigan is not one of them. Michigan only requires E-Verify for contractors and subcontractors of the state's transportation department. There are states that do require E-Verify for most private employers. As of March 31st of this year, there were states like Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and there are a handful of others. But I think you'd be hard pressed to require your staffing agency to utilize E-Verify. But that said, I think there are a host of other things that you could sort of put into place with your staffing agencies to try and sort of ensure that they're compliant, which you can ask to review their compliance processes and procedures. Um, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about this, Steve, from the
Well,
employment
I do,
perspective?
and I think this comes down to this is the way you're going to protect yourself here isn't necessarily so much an immigration protection as a contractual protection. So
Right.
what you've got to do is make sure that your contracts with these agencies are solid, that you've got good indemnification provisions in them, that you've got provisions in them that if these workers are all of a sudden removed from your workforce, if ICE shows up at the front door and carts out 5 guys, that you're going
Right.
to get replacements, right? And that you're going to be indemnified for any penalties or anything that comes out of that from ICE. Now, you can't get indemnified for criminal activity, and I don't know what criminal activity would be involved here, but you can certainly be indemnified for civil penalties and things like that. So you're going to want to make sure that your contracts with these agencies are as solid as they can be, and you protected your rights. And I think that's the best you can do. If you're going to continue to use these agencies that are going to bring in foreign nationals, they aren't your employees, so you don't technically have control over them, and you don't necessarily want that kind of control over them. That's why you use a temp agency to begin with, but you do want to know what's going on, and you do want to know what's going to happen. Not only if ICE walks in the door and takes 2 people out, but what happens if somebody gets sick? How are they going to be replaced, right? And what are your protections to make sure that you've still got the workforce you need to do the work that you have to do, and that you're not paying a bunch of penalties for something somebody else did.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, which I totally agree, is that the other thing I think you'd want to be really careful of is not utilizing a staffing agency as sort of a way to get around employing unauthorized workers, right? Like if you
Right.
know or have reason to know that the employees are not authorized to work in the US, the fact that you've contracted through a staffing agency is not necessarily going to protect you, right? If
And
you
I
have
agree with that.
knowledge,
I
then
agree with
that
that
gives rise.
100%. So if
Yeah,
you've got a bunch of emails going back that indicate you know exactly what's going on, that's
right.
not going to get you off the hook.
Right, and that can subject you to criminal penalties as well under US immigration laws
Uh,
for engaging in a pattern or practice of employing unauthorized workers, which you would want to avoid.
it's probably a conspiracy too, you know? Who knows?
Possibly.
All right.
Yes.
So thanks, Sarah. That's great. I know that there were other questions that people had. You guys can always reach out to Sarah. If you have any questions or any immigration issues at all, please reach out to Sarah and our immigration group. They'll be happy to help you. Otherwise, give us a call and we'll get you to the right place. Thanks for being with us. Thanks so much, Sarah. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.